rain had begun long before his train pulled into the station, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the cobbled streets of the city into slick black mirrors, fractured by the glow of lamps and the gliding reflections of hurried umbrellas. Marcus Whitfield stepped down from the cab with his briefcase in one hand, collar turned up against the wind. His business trip had already stretched past its intended 2 days, and the client he had flown across the continent to meet had postponed yet again. Exhaustion had wrapped itself around him like wet cloth. He wanted nothing more than a bed, 4 walls, and silence. The driver pointed toward a dim corner of the square, where an old hotel crouched between newer buildings, its facade a once grand face crumbling at the edges. Faded letters spelled out the Imperial across the weathered awning. Its windows glowed weakly behind sheer curtains that quivered in the drafts. Marcus hesitated, but the rain drove him across the street and under the awning where water dripped in fat rhythmic beats onto the pavement. Inside, the lobby smelled of dust and polish. The checkered floor stretched toward a reception desk of dark wood, where an elderly clerk sat with a ledger, a brass bell, and a clock that ticked far too loud for the space. No other guests lingered, only the echoes of the storm pressing against the tall windows. Marcus asked for a room. The clerk, without lifting his eyes, slid a key across the counter. It was heavy brass, worn at the teeth, with a tag that read only 0. Marcus frowned at the engraving but said nothing. His fatigue was too thick. He signed the register and carried his briefcase toward the lift that creaked like a throat clearing. The corridor on the top floor was long and silent, lined with identical doors, each numbered in faded brass. His footsteps made the carpet sigh. At the far end, tucked into a corner near the fire stairs, he found the door with the plaque that bore the solitary 0. It looked older than the others, its frame slightly warped, the paint around it peeling as though the wall itself rejected its presence. The key turned reluctantly in the lock, a grind of metal that felt too loud. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old tobacco and damp wallpaper. The light flickered once before steadying into a dim glow. There was a bed with stiff sheets, a wardrobe with a warped mirror, and curtains that hung heavy over a window that refused to open. He placed his briefcase on the desk and listened. The silence seemed thicker here, as though muffled, as though the air itself resisted sound. Sleep came poorly, fractured by strange impressions rather than dreams. He awoke twice certain someone had stood near the bed. Once he thought he heard footsteps in the wardrobe, though when he opened it, there was only the mirror showing his own pale face. The hands of the alarm clock crawled to morning with reluctance. When he descended to the lobby the next day, the clerk looked at him with a vague frown. Marcus placed the key on the desk and asked for his bill. The clerk tilted his head, confused. "We don't have that room, sir," he said, voice quiet but firm. "There is no room 0 in this hotel." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity, but the clerk's eyes did not waver. He pushed the key back across the counter with 2 fingers as though it carried a contaminant. Marcus glanced down. The key was different. The brass was tarnished darker, the number scratched nearly away, leaving only a faint circle, like the outline of something erased. He tried to protest, but the clerk closed the ledger with a sharp finality and repeated, "Sir, that key does not belong here." Outside, the rain had stopped, but Marcus felt a chill deeper than any storm. Marcus left the hotel for the day, but the unease clung to him like damp clothes. His meetings were a blur, his words rehearsed yet brittle, every glance at his watch an excuse to look away from the expressions of men who barely cared to listen. His thoughts pulled backward, to the key, to the way the clerk had pushed it away, as if refusing to acknowledge not just the room, but the fact that Marcus had ever occupied it. When the day's obligations ended, he found himself retracing the streets, not toward the modern district, where colleagues drank and laughed in restaurants, but back to the shadow of the hotel, as if the building itself exerted a pull. The Imperial seemed even older at nightfall, the lamps in the lobby dimmer than he remembered, the checkered floor scuffed to a dull gray. The air was heavy with polish, and something else beneath it, something that smelled faintly metallic, like the aftertaste of a penny. At the desk, the clerk was gone, replaced by a younger woman whose smile was thin and automatic. Marcus signed for another night and was handed a key to room 312. He took it without comment, though inside his chest something tightened. The lift groaned and rattled as it ascended, the numbers on the panel climbing steadily until the door opened onto the upper corridor. He passed doors marked 308, 310, 311, then 312. The walls here were fresher, the paint newer, but Marcus could feel the pull of that far corner, the place where the number 0 should be. He walked further down the hall, past 315, until the carpet gave way to older boards, the smell of dust sharpening. He stopped at the end where the wall met the stairwell. The corner where the door had been was now solid plaster, uneven, the faint outline of a frame, visible only if one squinted. It was as though the architecture itself had been rearranged in his absence. That night in room 312 he could not rest. The sheets smelled faintly of bleach, the air heavy with a draft that shifted without cause. Several times he woke to the sound of someone walking slowly down the hallway, steps measured and deliberate, pausing outside his door before fading again. At one point, he rose and opened the door. The corridor lay empty, but the carpet bore faint impressions, darker ovals pressed into the fibers as though by feet heavier than they should have been. He closed the door quickly, telling himself exhaustion could explain anything. The next morning, when he left his room, he found a slip of paper on the floor, folded once, placed precisely at the threshold. His name was written on it in blocky letters. Inside, scrawled in uneven ink, was a single line. "You belong in 0. The staff denied leaving any message. The young woman at the desk smiled politely, but insisted no notes had been sent. No guest had access to his floor. Marcus tucked the paper into his pocket, the words burning against his thigh like a hidden brand. That evening he avoided the lift, taking the stairs instead. At the landing where the old corridor branched, he ran his hand along the wall. The plaster was cool, but his fingers found a seam, a hairline crack that outlined the memory of a doorway. His pulse quickened. He pressed harder, and for a moment, he felt the surface shift beneath his palm, as though the wall were thin skin stretched over something hollow. He retreated, shaken, but when he returned to room 312, his suitcase was no longer where he had left it. It now sat beside the wardrobe, open slightly, though he was certain he had locked it. Inside, beneath his folded shirts, lay the brass key. The number on its tag was sharp again, uncorroded, gleaming faintly in the dim light. 0. That night, he did not sleep at all. Marcus spent the next morning in a haze of dread. He sat in the hotel's dining room with a plate of untouched food before him, listening to the scrape of cutlery and the murmur of other guests, whose faces he could never quite bring into focus. Every time he tried to look directly at one, their features seemed smudged, like an overexposed photograph. He left quickly, clutching his briefcase, though he could not recall placing anything important inside it. His meetings were abandoned. He wandered the city in circles, pausing at cafes, staring at newspapers and kiosks, without reading the words, always circling back to the Imperial. The hotel had become a magnet. That evening, back in his assigned room 312, the unease coiled tighter. The brass key lay on the nightstand, though he had locked it inside his suitcase again that morning. He considered taking it to the front desk, but the thought of the clerk's expression, that flat denial, that refusal to acknowledge what he knew he had seen, filled him with a deeper terror. They would not take the key. They would deny it existed. They would deny him. Near midnight, he rose from the bed, unable to resist. He carried the key to the far corridor, feet silent on the carpet, as if even the floorboards held their breath. At the plaster wall where the door had once stood, he inserted the key into nothing. For a moment, he felt foolish, his hand trembling in empty space. But then a resistance caught, a faint click, like a lock yielding. The seam in the wall shivered, dust trickling down in thin lines. And slowly, impossibly, a doorframe pressed itself forward, as if growing from the plaster. The brass plate with the number 0 gleamed, as if it had never been erased. Inside, the room waited. It was unchanged from that first night. The stiff bed, the heavy curtains, the warped mirror. Yet now the air felt charged, as though saturated with an unseen current. The wallpaper pulsed with faint discolorations that might have been stains, or might have been shadows shifting independently of light. The mirror's surface rippled faintly, as though disturbed water lay just beneath the glass. Marcus stepped inside. The key slid from his fingers and landed soundlessly on the desk, though he had not placed it there. He backed toward the bed, but froze as he noticed something new. On the wardrobe door hung a coat. It was his own, though he had left it in room 312. The pockets bulged with papers, and when he withdrew them, he found they were hotel registers. The pages bore his name written again and again, each in slightly different handwriting, each entry dated years apart. Some bore years long before his birth. He dropped the pages, heart hammering, but the silence swallowed even the sound of paper falling. The room no longer muffled sound. It devoured it. His breathing seemed trapped in his skull, his pulse pounding in his teeth. He turned to leave, but the door no longer aligned with the corridor. Instead, beyond the threshold, stretched a hallway longer and darker than any he had seen in the hotel. The carpet stained, the lamps flickering at intervals that stretched into blackness. He stumbled backward, hitting the bed frame. The mirror across the room pulsed again, and for an instant he saw himself reflected not as he was, but older, gaunter, his skin sagging, his hair thin and white. The older reflection raised a hand and pressed its palm against the glass, but Marcus's own hand remained at his side. The reflection smiled, teeth too many, too sharp. When he blinked, the mirror returned to normal, only his pale, exhausted face staring back. He bolted for the door, plunging into the unnatural corridor beyond. The air was colder here, the smell of damp stone mingling with something acrid, like burned cloth. The lamps hummed overhead, each buzzing light revealing another stretch of endless hall. Behind him, the door slammed shut, the brass plate rattling once before silence resumed. He ran, yet no matter how far, the corridor did not change. Doors doors lined the walls, each bearing numbers that descended: 211, 110, 45, 13, 4, 2, until finally only the number 0 appeared again, repeating on every door, hundreds of them, each identical. He staggered forward, dizzy, the air pressing heavy on his lungs. At last, he collapsed against one of the doors, and it swung inward without resistance. He fell into darkness, the smell of old tobacco and damp wallpaper rushing up to greet him. It was the same room again. The bed, the curtains, the wardrobe with its warped mirror. His briefcase sat on the desk where he had left it days ago, though he no longer remembered how many nights had passed. Time had folded, bent, hidden itself in the seams of the room. He was trapped. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his briefcase. The clasps glinted faintly in the dim lamplight. He had no memory of placing it here, no memory of bringing it from room 312. Yet it waited as if it had always belonged to this place. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, instead of shirts and documents, lay a collection of objects that were not his. A cracked wristwatch stopped at midnight, a child's shoe scuffed at the toe, a yellowed photograph of the hotel taken decades earlier when its facade still shone. He rifled deeper and found another photograph, and another, each showing a guest standing in the very room where he now sat. Some were in suits like his, some in dresses, some with suitcases, some without, but all wore the same hollow expression of fatigue and dread. The final photograph slipped free and landed on the bedspread. It was of Marcus himself, standing beside the wardrobe, his hand on the mirror. The mirror quivered at the edge of his vision. He turned toward it slowly. This time, his reflection did not mimic him. It stood straighter, smiled faintly, and stepped forward until its palm pressed flat against the glass. The surface rippled, and the reflection's hand broke through, pale and solid, grasping for him. Marcus stumbled back, but the air had thickened. Every movement felt slowed, syrup thick. The hand caught his wrist with iron force and pulled. The glass dissolved into liquid, swallowing him shoulder deep, then chest deep. He struggled, but his strength drained as if the mirror drank it. His reflection climbed out as he was pulled in, its face identical, but sharper, more alive, eyes bright where his own had dulled. It adjusted its tie, picked up the briefcase, and smiled down at him as he sank into the dark behind the glass. Then he was gone. The room fell silent again. The next morning, the hotel bustled with its ordinary rhythm. The storm had cleared, sunlight stretched across the square. At the reception desk, the clerk greeted a new arrival, a businessman stepping in from the street, weary from travel. His suit was neat, his briefcase polished. He signed the ledger with careful letters. The clerk handed him a brass key. The tag bore the number 0. When the guest turned toward the lift, the clerk quietly tore a page from the ledger. He slipped it into a drawer already thick with folded slips, each bearing the same name written in different hands, different years. The drawer closed with a soft thud, muffled under the sound of the ticking clock. And upstairs, in room 0, the mirror stilled its surface. The faintest ripple spread outward, as though something beneath it had sighed